Entra ora il corteo dei docenti rappresentanti delle facoltà di Psicologia di altre università. Entra il corteo del Senato accademico, è preceduto dai prorettori d'ateneo. Entra ora il corteo rettorale, in testa il rettore magnifico dell'Università degli Studi di Bologna, professor Pierugo Calzolari. Lo seguono il preside della facoltà di Psicologia, professoressa Bruna Zani, la professoressa Silvana Contento, proponente alla laurea professor Chomsky, il dottor Marco Costa, proponente alla laurea professor Irenäus Eibl-Eibesfeldt, e chiudono il corteo i laureandi, Noam Chomsky e il professor Irenäus Eibl-Eibesfeldt. Prende la parola il magnifico rettore dell'Università degli Studi di Bologna.
Autorità, carissimi professori, carissimi studenti, signore e signori, oggi l'Università di Bologna conferirà la laurea ad honorem in Psicologia a due studiosi che sono dei punti di riferimento mondiali della disciplina. Non solo della disciplina, ma due personalità di straordinario rilievo di tutta la cultura mondiale, Noam Chomsky e Irenäus Eibl-Eibesfeldt. Hanno portato contributi significativi, ma non solo nell'ambito delle scienze psicologiche, in molti altri ambiti disciplinari. Il percorso dei due laureandi è diverso. Hanno attraversato esperienze differenti, operato scelte diverse, ma un tratto li accomuna, oltre al fatto di essere nati nello stesso anno. 1928, penso si possa disvelare. Entrambi hanno arricchito le nostre conoscenze sull'uomo, affinando delle metodologie di ricerca che hanno prodotto risultati scientifici che poi sono diventati fondamentali per molte delle discipline insegnate nelle università del mondo. Noam Chomsky è docente, come ben noto, di linguistica all'MIT fin dalla metà degli anni 60. È il fondatore della linguistica generativa, che ha rivoluzionato, lo si può ben dire, le teorie linguistiche del Novecento. A lui siamo grati per aver assunto e mantenuto con successo un ruolo importante. Trasformare lo studio del linguaggio umano in un raffinato strumento di analisi che si è rivelato capace di spiegare non solo i comportamenti individuali, ma anche i comportamenti sociali e quelli politici. Il suo interesse per le conoscenze dei rapporti tra linguaggio e mente si è intrecciato fin da subito con l'interesse per i diritti umani, con la preoccupazione costante che attraversa tutta la sua opera per la libertà e per la giustizia. Una connessione che per Chomsky è quasi stato un sacerdozio, estremamente utile, che ha portato Chomsky a diventare una delle coscienze più vive, più critiche, più discusse, più fascinose del nostro tempo, ma anche una delle coscienze più ascoltate, quel che più importa, dai giovani. Irenäus Eibl-Eibesfeldt è docente di zoologia all'Università di Monaco, ma attualmente professore emerito all'Università di Vienna. Per 2 decenni si è occupato di studi etologici in ambito animale. Si è dedicato allo studio delle basi biologiche e culturali del comportamento umano. A lui si deve un merito indiscusso: aver fondato l'etologia umana, scienza che egli ha inventato e poi sviluppato con una serie di studi sui neonati, sui bambini e con un ampio programma di ricerche comparative, effettuate anche nel corso di lunghi soggiorni presso popolazioni tribali. Affidando sul campo i metodi di analisi delle componenti non verbali della comunicazione umana, egli ci ha aiutato a comprendere gli aspetti universali di questo comportamento e lo sviluppo di questo comportamento fin dalle prime fasi della vita. Insomma, cari studenti, voi vi trovate oggi in presenza di 2 personalità che stanno alla base della scienza moderna nel settore specifico al quale essi si sono applicati. L'Università di Bologna è onorata di presentarveli, è onorato di presentarlo al corpo accademico e alla città. Grazie.
Ha la parola la professoressa Silvana Contento per illustrare la figura di Noam Chomsky.
Grazie. Linguista, filosofo del linguaggio, storico delle idee, scienziato della mente, appassionato difensore dei diritti umani, Chomsky è uno studioso internazionalmente noto non solo alla comunità scientifica. La grande quantità di testi, saggi, articoli ed interventi tradotti in più lingue, i premi ed i riconoscimenti internazionali che gli sono stati conferiti, i dibattiti ai quali ha partecipato, assieme ad interviste e conferenze in tutto il mondo, e più di recente ancora i filmati a lui dedicati, testimoniano di una notorietà che fanno di Chomsky, lo studioso contemporaneo, sicuramente più citato. Infatti, mentre introduceva le linee fondamentali di un modello teorico del linguaggio, come capacità della mente, Chomsky appassionava con i suoi scritti, improntati ad un critico pacifismo radicale. Per questo oggi le sue numerose opere politiche, al pari di quelle linguistiche, conoscono una indiscussa diffusione mondiale e non smettono di animare dibattiti e riflessioni. Professore di linguistica, teoria linguistica, sintassi, semantica e filosofia del linguaggio all'MIT di Boston, dove ha insegnato di insegnare non ancora trentenne, Chomsky nasce a Filadelfia, studia presso l'Università di Pennsylvania, insegna ad Harvard e Princeton. Unisce nella sua formazione studi di matematica, filosofia e linguistica. Fondatore della scuola generativa, propone oggi un programma minimalista per le scienze cognitive. Fin dai primi scritti, Chomsky respinge con vigore le teorie linguistiche allora in auge, soprattutto in ambito statunitense. Oppone la ricerca di strutture innate a quelle di strutture acquisite del linguaggio naturale. In linea con le idee di Thomas Kuhn sull'azione di rottura delle teorie scientifiche, Chomsky contribuisce in modo determinante a fondare e successivamente a sviluppare, in contesti reali, una teoria che rappresenta il tentativo più compiuto di affrontare lo studio del linguaggio umano con un apparato concettuale e metodologico affine a quello delle scienze esatte. E la lezione che ascolteremo più tardi ne è un'armoniosa testimonianza. Chomsky ha conquistato una parte importante della propria notorietà mettendo in crisi la pertinenza di un approccio behaviorista al linguaggio. Ha insistito sulla estrema complessità delle regole grammaticali che stanno alla base dell'acquisizione del linguaggio, complessità imparagonabile alla relativa povertà di stimoli linguistici ai quali si è esposti nel corso dello sviluppo. Questi concetti, sviluppati in quella che è definita la rivoluzione cognitivista degli anni 50, rappresentano un cambiamento di prospettiva fortemente significativo in relazione allo studio del comportamento, del pensiero e dell'intelligenza umana. Spostando l'attenzione dai comportamenti ai meccanismi interni che li attivano, Chomsky segna lo sviluppo della moderna scienza cognitiva e di una nuova psicologia che saprà allora rivalutare i giudizi del parlante per capire i fenomeni psicologici fuori del ristretto spazio del laboratorio, spostare il focus attentivo del ricercatore dal dato osservato, il comportamento, al dato osservabile, la formulazione di esso, liberando la disciplina dal comportamentismo e affermando il cognitivismo. In Aspetti della teoria della sintassi, nel 65, e Riflessioni sul linguaggio, 10 anni dopo, Chomsky afferma la relazione tra aspetto interno e aspetto esterno del linguaggio. La grammatica può essere considerata un mezzo per percepire, capire, associare suoni a significati attraverso la mediazione di un sistema di strutture astratte generate dalla componente sintattica. Chomsky ammette di ispirarsi alla logica di Port-Royal, alle grammatiche del Settecento, che sorte come reazione al descrittivismo storicistico dei naturalisti, andavano alla ricerca di principi generali da cui derivare i fenomeni linguistici. In Conoscenza del linguaggio, nell'85, Chomsky dimostra che non esiste una nozione di linguaggio esterna alla mente umana e che lo studio dovrebbe concentrarsi sul costrutto mentale che determina la nostra conoscenza del linguaggio. Fin dall'inizio Chomsky unisce i suoi interessi scientifici alla funzione che essi hanno, perché considera inseparabili i nessi tra sapere e comunicazione, tra l'accademia, il mondo reale e i suoi ripetuti conflitti. In testi come I nuovi mandarini, Anno 501, La fabbrica del consenso, Linguaggio e libertà, conoscenza e libertà, Chomsky teorizza che la coerenza e la coesione dei nostri discorsi non sarebbero immaginabili se non fossero considerati espressione del nostro pensiero. Contro ogni forma di colonialismo, non solo culturale, egli mette in guardia dal ruolo esercitato dagli intellettuali, dai politici e dai giornalisti. Il mascheramento con un linguaggio opaco di eventi semplici mira soltanto ad isolare dalla sostanza dei fatti ed è collegati allora, inscindibilmente, gli aspetti interni con quelli esterni del linguaggio, poiché la performance comunicativa degli individui e dei media altro non è che l'espressione pragmatica di una tacita competenza. Il razionalismo di Chomsky ed il suo impegno politico e sociale possono così essere collegati e letti come di fiducia nella mente umana, nei suoi aspetti di universalità e insieme come monito a non cedere al sonno della ragione e, citando un suo celebre esempio, ai mostri delle idee verdi e senza colore che furiosamente dormono da essa generate.
Ha la parola la professoressa Bruna Zani, preside della facoltà di Psicologia, che leggerà il verbale con il quale il Consiglio di Facoltà ha deliberato il conferimento della laurea ad honorem.
I lavori di Noam Chomsky hanno profondamente rinnovato la linguistica, ma hanno avuto soprattutto importanti ricadute su molte discipline, quali la psicologia, l'intelligenza artificiale, la cibernetica, la traduzione automatica, la filosofia del linguaggio, la scienza cognitiva. È opinione condivisa che senza il contributo chomskiano la scienza cognitiva computazionale non sarebbe stato il paradigma dominante della ricerca sul comportamento fino alla metà degli anni '80 e non si sarebbero sviluppate, come è avvenuto, le scienze cognitive, aumentando così la nostra comprensione dei rapporti fra coscienza e razionalità. Noam Chomsky è autore di numerosi volumi, saggi e articoli, la maggior parte dei quali tradotti in più lingue, che rappresentano una traccia fondamentale per l'evoluzione delle teorie sul rapporto mente, linguaggio e conoscenza.
Il magnifico rettore dà lettura della pergamena di laurea.
Repubblica Italiana in nome della legge. Noi, professor Pier Ugo Calzolari, rettore dell'Alma Mater Studiorum Università di Bologna, veduta la deliberazione della Facoltà di Psicologia nell'adunanza del giorno 12 settembre 2003, veduta l'approvazione del signor Ministro dell'Istruzione, dell'Università e della Ricerca, proclamiamo Noam Chomsky, nato a Filadelfia il 7 dicembre 1928, dottore ad honorem in Psicologia e gli conferiamo il presente diploma di laurea a tutti gli effetti di legge, dato a Bologna il 1 aprile 2005. Students.
If you'll pardon me, I'll sit down. Is that okay? You want me to take this off? Okay. This is the kind of occasion that naturally leads one to think back over guiding issues of concerns and concerns of earlier years. In my personal case, that involves two almost parallel paths, almost parallel because they do converge short of infinity, though exactly how they converge is far from clear. One path seeks to understand more about language and mind. The other is guided by concerns for freedom and justice, and regrettably, human survival, not an idle concern in our era. There should be some shared elements, in particular what the co-founder of modern evolutionary theory, Alfred Russel Wallace, called man's intellectual and moral nature, the human capacity for creative imagination, language and symbolism generally, interpretation and recording of natural phenomena, intricate social practices and the like. It's a complex of capacities that seems to have crystallized fairly recently among a small group in East Africa, of which we are all descendants. The archaeological record suggests that the crystallization was so sudden in evolutionary time that some eminent scientists call the events the Great Leap Forward. There is a long and interesting history of thought about possible links between these domains, but they remain speculative and poorly understood. The only way to proceed, as far as I can see, is to say a few words about universality in language and in human rights, with barely a hint about the possible connections, a problem still very much on the horizon of inquiry. So to begin with, what about universality in language? The most productive way to approach the problem, I think, is within the framework of what has come to be called the Bio-Linguistic Perspective. It's an approach to language that began to take shape in the early 1950s, much influenced by recent developments in mathematics and biology. The approach interacted productively with a more general shift of perspective in the study of mental faculties, commonly called the cognitive revolution, though it would be more accurate, I think, to describe it as a second cognitive revolution, reviving and extending. The prominent American theoretician Martin Jost hardly exaggerated in a 1955 exposition when he identified the decisive direction as the decision that language can be described without any pre-existent scheme of what a language must be. Prevailing approaches in the behavioral sciences generally were similar. No one, of course, believed in the incoherent notion of a blank slate, but it was common to suppose that some initial delimitation of properties detected in the environment, given those undifferentiated learning mechanisms of some kind, account for what organisms know and do, humans included. The bio-linguistic approach, along with related areas of cognitive science, adopted a different stance. They took the object of inquiry to be not behavior and its products, but rather the internal systems that enter into action and interpretation. And at a deeper level, the basis in our biological nature for the growth and development of these internal systems. The goal was to discover what Juan Huarte in the 16th century described as the essential property of human intelligence, the capacity of the human mind to engender within itself by its own power the principles on which knowledge rests, ideas that were developed in important ways in the years that followed. For language, the principles on which knowledge rests are those of the internalized language, a certain cognitive state. I'll skip a few examples, which you have in the Italian translation. The general conclusion, I think, is that even the simplest human concepts appear to be entirely different from anything found in animal, symbolic, or communicative behavior. A significant problem for evolutionary theory, one of several, and the problems mount very rapidly when we move from words to expressions formed from them. One essential task of inquiry is to determine the principles on which such knowledge rests for the widest variety of possible human languages. A deeper problem is to discover what Huarte called the power to engender these principles of internal language. In current terms, that means the virtually uniform biological endowment that constitutes the human language faculty. The universal properties of language constitute, in effect, the genetic component of the language faculty. From this point of view, languages and other cognitive systems are taken to be, in effect, organs of the body, primarily the brain, to be investigated in the manner of other subcomponents that interact in the life of the organism, vision, motor planning, circulation of the blood, and others. Along with their role in behavior, the cognitive organs enter into activities traditionally regarded as mental. That's thought, planning, interpretation, evaluation, moral judgment, and so on. Behavior and its products, such as texts, provide data that may be useful as evidence to determine the nature and origins of cognitive systems, but they have no privileged status for such inquiries. One significant insight of the first cognitive revolution was that properties of the world that are called mental may involve unbounded capacities of a finite organ. That's the infinite use of finite means, in the phrase of Wilhelm von Humboldt. In a rather similar vein, David Hume had recognized that our moral judgments are unbounded in scope and must be founded on general principles that are part of their nature, are part of our nature, although they are beyond what he called our original instincts. That observation poses Huarte's problem in a different domain where we might find part of the thin thread that links the search for cognitive and moral universals. By the mid-20th century, it had become possible to face such problems in more substantive ways than before. By then, there was a clear understanding of finite generative systems with unbounded scope, which could be readily adapted to the reframing and investigation of some of the traditional questions that had necessarily been left obscure, though only some, it's important to stress. Humboldt referred to the infinite use of language, which is quite a different matter from the unbounded scope of finite means. Another influential factor in the renewal of the cognitive revolution in the 1950s was the work of ethologists, then just coming to be more widely known, with its concern for the innate working hypotheses present in subhuman organisms and the human a priori, which should have much the same character, Tinbergen and Lorentz in that case. This framework, too, could be adapted to the study of human cognitive organs and their genetically determined nature, which constructs experience and guides the general path of development, as in other aspects of growth of organisms. Well, I will again skip some discussion of later developments to the present. The quest for principled explanation faces daunting tasks. We can formulate the goals with reasonable clarity. With each step towards the goal, we gain a clearer grasp of the universals of language. It should be kept in mind, however, that any such progress still leaves unresolved problems that have been raised for hundreds of years. Among these are the mysterious problems of the creative and coherent ordinary use of language, a core problem of Cartesian science, and on until today. Well, we're now moving to domains of will and choice and judgment, and the thin strands that connect what seems within the range of scientific inquiry to essential problems of human life, in particular vexed questions about universal human rights. One possible way to draw connections is by proceeding along the lines of Hume's remarks, which I mentioned, his observation that the unbounded range of moral judgments must be founded on general principles that are part of our nature, although they are beyond our original instincts, which elsewhere he took to include, quoting him, the species of natural instincts on which knowledge and belief are grounded. In recent years, there's been intriguing work in moral philosophy and experimental cognitive science that carries these ideas forward, investigating what seem to be deep-seated moral intuitions that appear to have a very surprising character in invented cases. To illustrate, I'll instead take a real example that carries us directly to the issue of universality of human rights. In 1991, the chief economist of the World Bank wrote an internal memo on pollution in which he demonstrated that the bank should be encouraging migration of polluting industries to the poorest countries. The reason, I apologize for the rhetoric, but this is quotation from technical economics. The reason is that the measurement of the costs of health impairing pollution depends on the foregone earnings from increased morbidity and mortality. So it is rational for health impairing pollution to be sent to the poorest countries where mortality is higher and wages are lowest. Other factors lead to the same conclusion. the fact that what he called aesthetic pollution concerns are more welfare enhancing among the rich. People like us care about them more than poor people. He pointed out accurately that the logic of his memo is impeccable and that any moral reasons or social concerns that might be adduced could be turned around and used more or less effectively against every bank proposal for liberalization, so they cannot be relevant. The memo was leaked, and it led to a furious reaction, which was typified by Brazil's Secretary of the Environment, who wrote him a letter saying that his reasoning is perfectly logical but totally insane. The Brazilian minister was fired while the author of the memo became Secretary of the Treasury under President Clinton and is now the president of Harvard University. The reaction was indeed furious, leading to evasions and denials that we can ignore. What is relevant here is the virtual unanimity of the moral judgment that the reasoning is logical but insane. That merits a closer look, now turning to the modern history of human rights doctrines. The standard codification of human rights in the modern period is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in December 1948 by almost all nations, at least in principle. The Universal Declaration reflected a broad cross-cultural consensus. All of its components were taken to have equal status, from what are called anti-torture rights to socioeconomic rights, such as those enumerated in Article 25, which reads, everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care, and necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, or other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond his control. These provisions have been reaffirmed in enabling conventions of the General Assembly and international agreements on the right to development in almost the same words. It seems reasonably clear that this formulation of universal human rights rejects the impeccable logic of the chief economist of the World Bank, if not as insane, at least as profoundly immoral, which was in fact the virtually universal judgment, at least of those willing to appear in public. It's important, however, to stress the word virtually. As is well known, Western culture condemns some nations as relativists who interpret the Universal Declaration selectively, rejecting components that they do not like. And there has been great indignation about the so-called Asian relativists or the unspeakable communists who descend to this degraded practice. Less noticed is that the leader of the relativist camp is the leader of the self-designated enlightened states, the world's most powerful state. We see examples daily, although see is perhaps the wrong word, since we see them but do not notice them. I'll keep to the United States, but that's misleading. It may sometimes be a few steps ahead of the Western world in these respects, but there's in fact very little difference apart from distribution of power. A month ago, the press featured lead stories about the release of the State Department's annual report on human rights around the world. The spokesperson at the news conference was Paula Dobriansky, who is Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs. And she affirmed in her words that promoting human rights is not just an element of our foreign policy, it is the bedrock of our policy and our foremost concern. There is, however, a bit more to the story. Dobriansky was Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights in the Reagan and first Bush administrations, and in that capacity, she sought to dispel what she called myths about human rights, the most salient being the myth that so-called economic and social rights constitute human rights. She denounced the effort to obfuscate human rights discourse by introducing these spurious rights, which are entrenched in the Universal Declaration formulated at U.S. initiative, but which the U.S. government explicitly rejects, and increasingly the entire West within the framework of the neoliberal doctrines on which the chief economist of the World Bank was relying. I should stress that it is the U.S. government that rejects these provisions of the Universal Declaration. The American population strongly disagrees. One current illustration is the federal budget, which was announced last month, along with a study of public reactions to it carried out by the world's most prestigious institution for the study of public opinion. The public calls for sharp cuts in military spending, along with sharply increased social spending. That means education, medical research, job training, conservation, renewable energy, as well as increased spending for the United Nations and for economic and humanitarian aid, and also calls for a reversal of Bush's tax cuts for the wealthy. Government policy is dramatically the opposite in every respect. Studies of public opinion, which regularly demonstrate this very sharp divide between policy and public opinion, these are rarely even reported. So the public is not only removed from the arena of policy formation, but is also largely kept unaware of public opinion. There is, rightly, much international concern about the consequence of the rapidly expanding twin deficits in the United States. It means the trade and the budget deficit. Closely related is a third deficit, the growing democratic deficit, not just in the United States, but in the West generally. That is not discussed because it's welcomed by wealth and power, which have every reason to want the public to be largely removed from policy choices and implementation, a matter that should be of considerable concern, quite apart from its relation to the universality of human rights. It's depressingly easy to add many more examples, ranging across the full spectrum of rights affirmed in the Universal Declaration. And they teach us about two important topics: universal moral judgments and the elite moral and intellectual culture in which we live, which dramatically and forcefully rejects them. I'll end with a few observations on the current scene. We have just passed the 25th anniversary of the assassination of Archbishop Oscar Romero of El Salvador, who was called a voice for the voiceless, and also the 15th anniversary of the murder of 6 leading Latin American intellectuals, Jesuit priests. These two events framed the hideous decade of the 1980s in Central America. Archbishop Romero and the Jesuit intellectuals were murdered by security forces armed and trained by Washington, in fact, by the present incumbents or their immediate mentors. And the same is true of most of the hundreds of thousands of other victims. The Archbishop was assassinated while he was performing Mass, shortly after he wrote to President Carter, pleading with him not to send aid to the brutal military junta in El Salvador, which the Archbishop wrote, will sharpen the repression that has been unleashed against the people's organizations fighting to defend their most fundamental human rights. Terror escalated, always with U.S. support and Western silence and complicity. If anything remotely similar had happened in Eastern Europe in those years, the events would be known and the anniversaries commemorated, assuming, that is, that outrage had not led as far as nuclear war. The differentiating principle is crystal clear and is probably close to a historical universal. For the powerful, our own crimes do not exist. We must not remember the grim fate of those who were fighting to defend their most fundamental human rights, nor should we remember who bears responsibility for these atrocities. In societies that value their freedom, it would be unnecessary to recount any of this because it would be taught in schools and well known to everyone. And the same would be true of the continuing atrocities taking place right now by military forces armed and trained by Washington with the support of its Western allies. For example, in Colombia, which is the leading human rights violator in the hemisphere, and for many years, the leading recipient of U.S. military aid and training. The State Department reports that last year, Colombia retained its record of killing more labor activists than the rest of the world combined. A few weeks ago, the military broke into the first and the most important of the towns that had declared themselves to be zones of peace, murdering one of its founders and others, including children aged 2 and 6. Little is known about these matters, apart from the circles of people who really are devoted to defending universal human rights. Well, I mentioned these few examples to remind ourselves that we are not merely engaged in seminars on abstract principles or discussing remote cultures that we do not understand. We're speaking of ourselves and the moral and intellectual values of the privileged elite communities in which we live. And if we do not like what we see when we look in the mirror honestly, we have every opportunity to do something about it.
Studenti, ecco un intellettuale cui non manca la conoscenza, ma cui soprattutto non manchi il coraggio. Grazie professor Chomsky per questa coraggiosa lezione di morale, per questa difesa del concetto di universalità di diritti umani. E il pensiero non può che correre immediatamente ad un'altra voce alta, si sta lentamente spegnendo nei palazzi vaticani, ma il pensiero corre immediatamente ad un altro grande difensore dei diritti umani. Prego.
Ha la parola il dottor Marco Costa per illustrare la figura di Irenäus Eibl-Eibesfeldt.
Nella prospettiva dell'etologia umana e della psicologia evoluzionistica, una spiegazione del comportamento non può limitarsi all'individuazione delle cause prossime, ma deve rifarsi all'ampia prospettiva della storia evolutiva della nostra specie, alla comparazione del nostro comportamento con quello di altri animali, primati in particolare. Il merito di Eibl-Eibesfeldt, quale fondatore dell'etologia umana, è stato quello di rendere scientifiche e di sistematizzare quelle intuizioni che già Charles Darwin aveva teorizzato nel 1872 in The Expression of Emotion in Men and Animals, ovvero che l'uomo andasse studiato con gli stessi metodi utilizzati per lo studio del comportamento animale, che uomini di culture diverse sul piano del comportamento sono molto più simili di quanto affermato dai sostenitori del relativismo culturale e che il comportamento umano si è evoluto su quegli stessi principi di selezione, adattamento che era venuto delineando nella sua teoria dell'evoluzione. Nato a Vienna il 15 giugno del 1928, Irenäus Eibl-Eibesfeldt ha studiato zoologia all'Università di Vienna, dove ha conseguito il dottorato nel 1949, approfondendo i temi dell'etologia, della morfologia comparata, dell'ecologia e della biologia teoretica. Nel 1949 diviene ricercatore nel gruppo condotto dal premio Nobel e fondatore dell'etologia Konrad Lorenz nel suo istituto di Altenberg. Nel 1951, su invito della Max Planck Gesellschaft, si trasferisce in Germania insieme a Konrad Lorenz, fondando l'istituto Max Planck per la fisiologia del comportamento a Seewiesen in Baviera. Nel 1963 diviene assistente presso la cattedra di zoologia dell'Università di Monaco di Baviera e dal 1970 professore presso la stessa università. Nel 1988 l'istituto Max Planck di fisiologia del comportamento da lui diretto si trasferisce da Seewiesen ad Andex, dove tuttora è attivo pur avendo cambiato il nome in Istituto Max Planck di etologia umana. Dal 1992 è codirettore insieme a Karl Grammer dell'Istituto Ludwig Boltzmann di etologia urbana presso il Dipartimento di Antropologia dell'Università di Vienna, dove ho avuto il piacere di lavorare nel 2002. La sua iniziale carriera scientifica si è sviluppata in due linee principali: lo studio dei primi stadi di sviluppo nei mammiferi e lo studio della comunicazione animale. Nel 1953 e 1954 fu invitato da Hans Haas a partecipare alla spedizione Xarifa di biologia marina presso le isole Galapagos e diverse isole dell'Oceano Indiano. Fu il primo a lanciare il grido di allarme per la minaccia alla fauna e alla flora unica di queste isole, determinata dall'aumento dei suoi abitanti e dei flussi turistici. In un memorandum inviato all'UNESCO egli propose misure preventive che vennero accolte nel 1957. Queste attività ambientaliste sfociarono nell'istituzione della Charles Darwin Foundation, della quale è stato membro fin dagli inizi del comitato esecutivo, e nella creazione della stazione di ricerca intitolata Charles Darwin nell'isola di Santa Cruz nelle Galapagos. Nel 1967 pubblica Grundriss der vergleichenden Verhaltensforschung, etologia e biologia del comportamento, per molti anni considerato il più completo ed accurato manuale di etologia. A partire dagli anni 60 i suoi interessi virano sul comportamento umano, pur mantenendo l'enfasi sulla comunicazione e l'ontogenesi. Attraverso studi su bambini sordi e ciechi dalla nascita, egli ha individuato un ricco repertorio di movimenti espressivi e di risposte sociali che mostrano un chiaro adattamento filogenetico e che risultano geneticamente determinati. Bambini sordi e ciechi dalla nascita mostrano infatti, senza possibilità di averle apprese, pattern di espressioni facciali e di emozioni coerenti come la paura nei confronti di estranei. Nel 1964 e 1965 si dedica ad uno studio pilota di documentazione filmica di interazioni umane in modo non intrusivo, sviluppando con Hans Haas una tecnica che attraverso l'uso di uno specchio posto ad angolo di fronte all'obiettivo della cinepresa permetteva di filmare individui in interazione senza che questi si accorgessero di essere direttamente ripresi. Dal 1967 ha cominciato una sistematica documentazione di comportamenti sociali e di rituali così come occorrono in contesti ecologici. Dal 1970 allarga gli obiettivi di questo progetto di documentazione su scala cross-culturale, includendo culture tradizionali in diversi stadi di evoluzione culturale, con differenti strategie di sussistenza e diverse organizzazioni sociopolitiche. Documenta i comportamenti quotidiani ed i rituali presso i cacciatori-raccoglitori del Calare centrale, gli Anomani cacciatori dell'Orinoco, gli Eipo agricoltori primitivi della Nuova Guinea occidentale, gli Imba ad economia prevalentemente pastorale presso il Kaokoland, Namibia, gli abitanti delle isole Trobriand e dell'isola di Bali nell'arcipelago indonesiano. In aggiunta a queste culture, che sono state visitate ripetutamente nel corso degli anni, effettua delle osservazioni sistematiche anche in altre culture come quella degli aborigeni australiani, delle Filippine e armene. Lo scopo principale di questa documentazione, che ha raggiunto negli anni la ragguardevole lunghezza di 350 km di pellicole, era quello di verificare quali comportamenti umani sono da considerarsi come universali, ovvero presenti e documentabili in tutte le culture, senza che queste fossero venute in contatto fra di loro, e quali comportamenti invece sono maggiormente influenzati dallo sviluppo culturale e quindi specifici di diverse culture. È da queste ricerche che nasce l'etologia umana come disciplina autonoma. Nelle sue osservazioni sul campo, egli si concentra su aspetti comunicativi come l'uso delle sopracciglia nel saluto oculare, nelle espressioni di sorpresa, nel rapporto madre-bambino, le espressioni facciali delle emozioni di base, i correlati non verbali dell'imbarazzo e della vergogna. Il suo interesse spazia anche nel campo della psicologia e dell'estetica, dove studia la costanza dei simboli artistici nei diversi contesti culturali, come ad esempio l'importanza dell'occhio quale segnale estetico, portando avanti le ricerche del suo maestro Otto König e studiando quanto vi è di comune nelle espressioni musicali e di danza nelle diverse culture. Nel 1970 pubblica il libro Liebe und Hasse zur Naturgeschichte elementare Verhaltensweisen, Amore e odio, dove sottolinea l'importanza della neotenia nello sviluppo dei comportamenti prosociali e di cooperazione. Lo sviluppo dell'intelligenza è andato di pari passo con un rallentamento dello sviluppo. I neonati della nostra specie nascono in uno stadio neurologico altamente plastico, necessitano per lo sviluppo di molti anni di cure parentali. Allo stadio adulto, inoltre, si riscontra il permanere di comportamenti ludici che viceversa scompaiono con la maturità negli altri primati. Nel 1979 esce Krieg und Frieden aus der Sicht des Verhaltensforschung, etologia della guerra, in cui mette in rapporto le ricerche di Konrad Lorenz sull'aggressività, le ricerche dell'aggressività interspecifica negli animali e le ricerche paleoantropologiche ed antropologiche sui conflitti nell'uomo preistorico e presso le popolazioni primitive, per arrivare a delineare i meccanismi scatenanti dei conflitti infraspecifici nella nostra specie. Nel 1984 viene pubblicato il suo saggio più importante, Die Biologie des menschlichen Verhaltens, Grundriss der Humanethologie, etologia umana, le basi biologiche e culturali del comportamento. Il primo manuale in cui vengono trattate sistematicamente le conoscenze acquisite applicando i metodi etologici allo studio del comportamento umano. Il manuale segna la fondazione dell'etologia umana come disciplina scientifica. Nel 1991 concretizza i suoi interessi per la psicologia ambientale, fondando insieme al suo allievo Karl Grammer il Ludwig Boltzmann Institut für Stadtethologie, Istituto di Etologia Urbana, presso l'Università di Vienna, con lo scopo di studiare l'evoluzione del concetto di abitazione, gli effetti psicologici del sempre maggiore inurbamento della popolazione e della sovrappopolazione nei centri urbani. Dimostra nei suoi studi come l'espansione selvaggia delle periferie delle città con soluzioni architettoniche centrate sulla massificazione, assenza di verde, spersonalizzazione, porti ad un aumento dell'incidenza dei disturbi psicologici, del tasso di criminalità, di insoddisfazione nella popolazione che vi risiede. In una spedizione in Venezuela, studiando il problema delle favelas nella capitale Caracas, ha dimostrato come fosse errata la politica di trasferire gli abitanti in grattacieli di nuova costruzione e come invece un miglioramento delle condizioni in sito, portando acqua potabile, elettricità, costruendo fognature, lasciando agli abitanti la facoltà di ristrutturare o di migliorare da soli la propria abitazione, portasse ad una notevole collaborazione da parte degli abitanti, che in tal modo conservavano la loro rete di relazioni sociali essenziali per il benessere psicologico. Dal 1986 al 1993 è stato presidente dell'International Society for Human Ethology e dal 1983 è Fellow dell'American Association for the Advancement of Sciences. È stato insignito nel 1995 della medaglia al merito dalla Repubblica Federale Tedesca e nel 1998 della medaglia al merito della Repubblica Austriaca. Nel corso della sua attività scientifica è stato autore e coautore di quasi 600, fra pubblicazioni scientifiche, interventi in riviste di divulgazione e monografie.
Ha la parola la professoressa Bruna Zani, preside della facoltà di Psicologia, che leggerà il verbale con il quale il Consiglio di Facoltà ha deliberato il conferimento della laurea honorem.
Il professor Irenäus Eibl-Eibesfeldt ha contribuito significativamente allo sviluppo dei concetti di base dell'etologia e alla divulgazione di questa disciplina, di cui ha scritto il primo manuale sistematico. Ha avuto il merito di estendere i metodi dell'etologia allo studio del comportamento umano, fondando l'etologia umana. Nel suo lavoro, con popolazioni collocabili a diversi stadi dell'evoluzione culturale, egli ha prodotto un abbondante materiale documentario di valore unico, conservato nell'archivio cinematografico di etologia umana presso il Max Planck Institute di etologia umana di Andex, che costituisce un patrimonio prezioso a disposizione delle future generazioni di ricercatori. Ha fortemente promosso lo studio della comunicazione non verbale nell'uomo, giungendo alla formulazione di una grammatica universale del comportamento sociale e ideando i primi metodi per l'osservazione non intrusiva. Si è dedicato allo studio delle somiglianze interculturali nei movimenti espressivi nell'uomo e ha approfondito l'analisi del rapporto fra ontogenesi e filogenesi, apportando contributi importanti al dibattito natura-cultura nello sviluppo dei comportamenti.
Repubblica Italiana in nome della legge. Noi, professor Pierugo Calzolari, rettore dell'Alma Mater Studiorum Università di Bologna. Veduta la deliberazione della Facoltà di Psicologia nell'adunanza del giorno 23 ottobre 2003. Veduta l'approvazione del signor Ministro dell'Istruzione, dell'Università e della Ricerca, proclamiamo Irenäus Eibl-Eibesfeldt, nato a Vienna il 15 giugno 1928, dottore ad honorem in psicologia, e gli conferiamo il presente diploma di laurea a tutti gli effetti di legge, dato a Bologna il 1 aprile 2005.
Il professor Irenäus Eibl-Eibesfeldt leggerà la sua lezione dottorale.
Magnifico rettore, preside chiarissima, preside, colleghi e colleghe e colleghi, signore e signori. To confer this honor, I appreciate it very much, and I know the importance and the significance of this most precious gift. The University of Bologna has the distinction to be the oldest one in Europe. That's one interesting thing to say. My dear colleague, Professor Costa, has already said something about my interests. I want to add that we north of the Alps are very well aware of Italy's or the Roman contribution to European culture. We know that Latin, or that we are fully aware that Latin, and I probably know that you are fully aware too, has been the language of the sciences, of the church, of the arts, of the law for over 1,000 years for us in Northern Europe, as you might call it. And as a joke of history, when Napoleon had put an end to the Holy Roman Empire of German nation, he robbed the basilica of the antique columns and brought them to Paris. The Germans took them back again in 1870. Our history was full of conflict about supremacy, but we all shared, besides our national pride, the awareness of a shared cultural heritage which created a constitution and on a higher level an European identity, which is alive and which has also its emotional, it's felt as an identity. Just by coincidence, the latest issue of the German cult or the Bavarian cultural magazine presents on its cover a painting of the romantic German painter Johann Friedrich Overbeck, showing Italy, Italia and Germania in sisterly affection. The little white-blue flag in the hand of Italia, in the hands of Italia, is contributed by the editor of this Bavarian journal. It's the 1st January 2005. It's a nice, touching picture, but it tells more. It tells that besides all our, it was sometimes a hate-love relationship, but love dominated, since after all these troubles, again, people went there, learned. And Lawrence, in his book on aggression, discussed the chances for peace and the chances to eliminate the many prejudices people cultivate. He wrote, "No one is able to hate wholeheartedly a nation amongst whose members he has several friends. Being friends with a few people of a population is enough to raise a healthy mistrust of all those generalizations which brand the Russians, English, Germans, etc., with a typical and usually hateful national characteristics." End of the quote. I'm happy to count on a few close friends in Italy and open to making a few more. In recognition of this hospitality, I want to reciprocate about strategies of social interactions, well knowing that it must be a very sketchy presentation since no time is left. Yesterday, I spoke, and I hope some of you have heard it, I spoke about the cross-cultural documentation of behavior, which I started 35 years ago. In longitudinal studies, the cultures were mentioned in the Italian introduction today, so I need not to talk too much about the technique and all that. The interest came about since after 20 years of studying animal behavior, I had acquired the theoretical foundation, so to speak, and also the methodology, which allowed me to take up an enterprise, Lawrence had said once, which was the most important he's considered, to find out by research on man whether the concepts he and Tinbergen had developed were to be founded through the study of man. And I first started with the deaf and blind born, which grow up in eternal darkness and silence. And even though they can never mimic facial expressions, I showed a film yesterday. They can never mimic facial expression. Nonetheless, they show smiling, they show crying. This girl lays on a bench. She was sleeping, caressed by her mother, left by her mother. Then she starts to cry. Also, stranger awareness and these patterns mature in these children. For example, that they are very reserved against strangers, even though they have never experienced anything bad from them. They could never have acquired the knowledge of the script of the muscle actions, which have to contract in a coordinated way to produce this expression. But of course, the information we can get from the deaf and blind born is limited. And therefore, I started this cross-cultural enterprise, picking out 5 cultures which were traditional, and in a model depicting different stages of the cultural evolution. And I have perhaps to say a few and other things. The picture will come next before I enter this. Can I have the next slide? Yeah. It was argued, and is still argued up till now, that we can, since we can never deprive an animal or a human being of all information and raise it in complete social isolation, which no one would ever suggest, but animals could learn within the egg. They are exposed to stimulation, self-stimulation processes, and they could learn in utero by self-stimulation or by external stimulation. But the problem is not that stimuli could form experiences or act as experiences. But the problem is, and Lawrence answered it very clearly, that we have to deal with adaptations. And adaptations fit like a cast to a mold. And already the word implies this fitting. And it is relevant information about the cast, which we can deprive an animal of. If we observe that mallards have highly complicated courtship postures, like head up, tail up, grunting whistle, etc. That's all from Lawrence's work. Then we can ask ourselves, do they need a social model to learn the script by imitation? And if you deprive an animal from this source of information, and it nonetheless shows these courtship patterns at sexual maturity, etc., then we have proven that those modules, motor modules, which generate the coordinated pattern with all the feedbacks they might need, with all the receiving stimuli to trigger the responses, etc., grows to maturity and biologic as a process of self-differentiation. And we know that this is the receptor apparatus, etc. We have many ample of examples, and already Carmichael in 1922 to 24, as early as that, raised from a batch of eggs of frogs, tadpoles, the ones under complete, with an anestheticum and as a narcotic, and the others just naturally. When the others swam freely, those which he removed the narcotic, the others began immediately to move. That has all been hushed up and nothing. You have still the concept, everything is just a construction, it can be reconstructed in any plausible way. So much only about theory. I wouldn't go into more detail, but just mention that, of course, the processes of self-differentiation have been studied ever since Spemann found out how the egg cup, the rim of the egg cup induced lens formation in the epidermis, even if it's implanted in the belly region. Sperry's famous experiments need to be mentioned. And of course, up till now, Nobel Prize presented Nüsslin, for example. So let's we want to go. Whenever a behavior fits mirrors a model or otherwise fits its environment, we are in a position to clear whether an adaptation is phylogenetic, whether and what needs to be learned. That's also bird song. We need learning, but learning is also secured by a brain that evolved to learn what is interesting for the survival, what the learning capacities were selected for. So the study of the deaf and blind, another argument was when that expressions are so variable. They vary in intensity, but with the Lorentz matrix, and they superimpose two different ones. For example, if you have 3 stages of aggression in the dog or wolf, and 3 for fear, you get already quite a number of different expressive movements, which nonetheless go back to a few variables, so to speak, and here you have the same, a computer superposition of anger and joy. And then you get this interesting grimacing of one who is a little bit frightened also, but still half happy to see him. And so that's what concerns variability. My cross-cultural studies revealed many universals to the detail. And one of these interesting details is the eyebrow flash, a rapid movement of the eyebrow for 1/6 of a second. And to my great surprise, it was not found in literature, except in poetry, where they speak of an aufleuchtende Augen, since the eye white shines up when the eyes are really wide open. But I found that most people studying facial expression were asking, and great number of people, please smile, please laugh, please do such things. And of course, you don't get an eyebrow flash in such a situation. And I work in the field, and I work with an inobtrusive method, and you can also analyze then the eyebrow flash, for example. If you take the Horzier-Ekman facial action with the muscle, with the labels, and then you see that's the script, what you see. Every dot here is one picture of a film. First, that is a group which we contacted in 1974 as the first time. A really intact Neolithic horticulturist culture in the New Guinean part of the Star Mountain range. Then the face brightens up. Then you get a head toss and the eyebrows raise. And then you get the cut off in between, since of course the eyes, the move, if you look constantly at the person, you have a negative arousal. Therefore, the arousal they control by looking away. Children do the same, by the way. Now, this is of course just one action. The eyebrow flash is embedded. Here you see it in different cultures. I have also a film, I showed it yesterday. Time will not suffice. Therefore, I'm unfortunately not in a position to talk so fast like my dear foreign, not you, but the Italians have done. But here you have a French, here you have a Balinese, And here you have a Bushman, only 2 stages of this to give you the idea. Then you have a number of other examples, but we don't think. Now, we found furthermore that even behaviors which on the surface look very different, like a greeting, obey to the same rules. For example, there is a situation of greeting when I greet a person which with a friendly intent, and I expect also a friendly intent from him, since I'm, for example, invited, but I don't know him yet very well. When Yanomami are invited for a feast, then you see a greeting dance of the guest. And he dances around in this shabona, which you yesterday saw in the pictures, and utters aggressive stances. He has a war dance, and he bows, spannt den Bogen, and behaves not in a very friendly way. I am thirsty for meat and blood, but his little son, he's happily dancing toward on his side, waving green fronds of palm. What do you see here? In antithetic display, he behaves manly, aggressive. Just don't subdue me, don't try to be dominant, he signals to the other. Since treachery is very common in those Yanomami, unfortunately I cannot enter this subject, but it's interesting. Man is very ambivalent toward his fellow being, but also he has war paint, dark, but he counteracts it with white dunes of eagle, and the same type of behavior you see in a greeting dance here in Bali. When they have their temple feasts, visitors of several villages come together. You had a flower offering dance, and you have a baris, a war dance, and in this greeting dance, this is combined. Before the girls, 3 pairs of girls start with silver bowls with flowers, and before they start to throw this out to the people, they dance this war dance, and the others throw flowers. So in antithetic, and actually, whenever we greet, and we don't know each other too well before, we shake hands, and we respond to the grip. It's a firm grip males use to exchange, not sort, but if something is without tonus, like a dead chicken or something, no, or if you cannot respond to, you have also the feeling, sorry, that I couldn't show. There's ambivalence in our behavior from the early days on. Here you have one Epo man visiting another. The other is the father. And you see that this man makes a mistake. He tries to be friendly. A, B, from films taken. B, he tries to be, A and B, he tries to be friendly to the son of his host, which was a failure. He did it, was too friendly, and the little boy is running toward safety to his father. And now he looks a little bit betrayed. But that's typical. We have other types of other observations in other cultures. Was it really following? Good. Then we say, you saw in the next picture a Bushman baby, no, a Bushman girl, and she hides, no, let's continue. She hides her lower face. She hides also her lower face. Just go on. Since I wanted originally to say, baby, she hides also her face. She hides the smiling. Since if you open yourself to communication, you make yourself vulnerable. Therefore, she behaves coy, you find it as one of the universals. And I had it also in a sequence yesterday with a small Gui baby from the Bushman. She was also hiding her face like this. Okay, we continue. Here you have in Europe a little girl, a colleague of mine, Wickler, looking at this girl, which my daughter holds, and she shows withdrawal movements combined with approach signals in a friendly way. The next, here you see the same in Bali. You have a Balinese mother. She tells her little son to wave. You see it's taken with mirror lenses, and the camera runs alone, and I smile at her. I do not anything more, but then they two show coyness behavior. Now, here you have that what I wanted actually a little bit earlier. A baby, a hand to the mouth, hiding, turning away, looking from the corner of the eye to the fellow who is at the right here. Then again, looking away, again, frame 287, looking toward by the way, man is very much oriented in facial face-to-face communication, and the white eyeballs make every eye movement visible, which is fantastic. And I worked for several months each year for 3 years in the middle 80s at Jane Goodall's place. She had asked me to film her chimpanzees. One had the white eyeballs. You can speculate, is it an ornament or is it a rudiment? Cortland made the speculation that the ancestrals of the chimpanzees were more advanced and got pressed back by the more successful Australopithecines. Here you have again this coyness behavior. Interesting to what details the cross-cultural. We have an expression for the vorletzte Bild, which says, sie verbeißt sich das Lächeln. Okay, we continue, that's enough. We have now object transfer. Object transfer feeding. Already small babies are very active in feeding other persons. That's her older sister. And they have a nice dialogue of taking and giving, and she readily she wants her to take it in the mouth and makes the same movement which mothers make when they feed a baby with a spoon. They open the mouth and do the same behavior. And feeding and sharing and giving is one of the fundamental pro-social behaviors which you observe already very early in childhood. You observe the children, for example, share, as you can see it here, and I will show a short clip of this film. They readily share, provided that the one who wants something doesn't put any pressure on the other, but perhaps just suggests, since the other is the owner. And ownership must be respected. Then, and only if you own something, you can give. That was sometimes in a very progressive way of educating. Everything belongs to every child. That's nonsense. It doesn't work. Since if you have, you can friendly gift. It's in many rituals. For example, the tooth filing ritual, which I filmed on Bali. After they had their tooth filings, they got with a shawl connected in pairs, and then the pairs then have to feed each other with a sweet past, and they do it. They like to do it, and you see how they behave in a friendly way. Object transfer is widespread also in reclam, also this. Giving, and we don't only give, but we host people and feed them, and which is an extension of this giving of food. And it's a bit too fast, but I'm told that it's not only food which we give, but we give everything. And we have to respect that the one is the owner, he can give, and he builds always up an obligation. Already Mauss observed this, and it's really universal. You are expected to reciprocate, not with the same, but if you go, for example, sometimes supermarkets offer a coffee to you, and you like this gratis coffee. But if you want to go out, you have a feeling, oh, I should buy at least a toothbrush or something like that. There are many, there's a whole book written on this subject. This can be perverted in an interesting way culturally, since the quackyutle of the northeast coast of Vancouver coast, the chiefs have prestigious hostings, in which the hosts, the guests, are always tried to output them and thus shame them, since if they cannot reciprocate with the same, they waste values, they give and give and give and give and destroy things. Ruth Benedict and a number of others have, they sing even insulting songs. Is any one of you little chiefs here in a position to reciprocate like this, etc., etc.? So there are rules of, and another form of giving, it has its old root. Giving of food and passing food in chimpanzees is a behavior. At a certain age, babies which drink are also fed with this little, from mouth to mouth. And greeting is sometimes mouth to mouth and kiss feeding. I filmed the same in a grandma and her little grandson, mouth to mouth feeding by kiss feeding. And it's interesting as a tender behavior. It's, next please, it's widely spread in cultures, mouth to mouth feeding, and actually kissing occurs and mouth to mouth feeding occurs also in our culture. It's not done so openly, but it occurs. And that brings us to one theme about which I wrote the whole book. It came with maternal care in the outfit of being nurtured and came into the world. And it was a pre-adaptation to so to speak, to develop higher sociality, since it was also individualized bonding, thus the we and the other, our family, extended family, but nurturant behavior made friendly caretaking behavior amongst adults during courtship, etc. possible. Now I want to show you one example of film of a Yanomami mother, and we can look at a few interesting scenes, and it shows that mothers, for example, like their children. You see two eating together friendly, two Yanomami children. She shows the blue tongue, since it was, these fruits are blue. There are blueberries in our country. We used to show our blue tongue, also our friends, when we ate them. Now she tries to get something. You had a refusal, but afterwards she held her hand up like this. Now she complains a little bit. Too few berries on them. So she gives her theirs. They share willingly. It was only this one scene when she tried to grasp. Now, again an example, two Epo children, half siblings. The little half sister wants a bite of this taro. he cannot share. Now mother comes into the picture, and I will soon say, stop for a moment since I have a question. You will see his mother asked, now stop please. What will the mother do now? She broke it, you saw, in 2 pieces. What will the mother do now? Yeah, what will the mother do now? She broke it in 2 pieces. What will she do? Fine, thank you. You are an artist. Now what will she do? She gives both to. Most people say, no, mother shares now and gives one to the older and one to the son and one to the half-sister. But this way she allowed him to share, and she didn't insult him. She didn't rob. She helped in sharing. Now they are unisono. She mimics his behavior. That's also a way to show agreement. I do what you did. Tuk. She will also make tuk in a moment. Tuk, yes, yes. Okay. Now we get there. It's these details which you get in film, which make it so interesting. What we next see is building up a friendly relation. She has the girl to the right gives this little girl what we had. Yes, has given a little thing. Now she wants something. She knew already. This passing of the nut from her to her built up an obligation. And now she wants from the chewing gum. It's on the Trobriand Island. We gave her chewing gum. And now she feels obliged to share. Difficult to share chewing gum. No, don't eat too much. Don't take it all away. Otherwise, I rob it. Hiding behind the back. Okay, now we go to the Yanomami mother. With the Yanomami mother, which we had already shot. This mother is a very nice document, since she interacts with her little son and hugs him and kisses him and says, "You are so wild, wild, wild. Be wild." Also Vaiteri, Vaiteri. You hear again and again the Vaiteri. And then she kisses him everywhere, by the way. She would be arrested in our culture. If you read in a number of books nowadays, mother love is just an invention of late civilization. It's nonsense. A little bit louder, perhaps. She interprets every utterance as a contribution to a dialogue. Very Entwicklungsstufen adäquat. A baby talk in all cultures. 1 octave higher than normal and simplified. If my secretary talks in this voice, I know that she's not talking to do some business, but she also says we have all the transcriptions of what they say, and she says you have such wild teeth, etc. She has 2 little teeth, but she behaves fierce. He should behave fierce. She also says, you are bragging with your penis, but it's like a lumbricus, just like this. Oh yes. Immediate arrest. But they do it only to the babies, and not only to the males. They enjoy them. That's all. And now comes the next sister and tries to do the same. And I think we stop here. And if you want a few eyebrow flashes, I can show them to you too, since that's also at the farewell. That's Germany.
Uns Menschen soziale
A mother.
Kontaktbereitschaft aus.
And always watch the eyebrows. And here you see the baby doesn't respond, but you get, oh God, an eyebrow flash. A grandma, that's her little son in front. You see just
Auch
this.
Erwachsene begrüßen sich untereinander so. Hier eine
French,
Französin, hier eine Deutsche,
that's
eine
Balinese.
Balinese, eine Balinesin,
Balinesin, yes.
ein Ceylonese,
That's too dark, unfortunately, the projection.
eine junge Frau von der Südseeinsel Rangiroa. Der gleiche, sehr formkonstante Bewegungsablauf bei einem Mann von Rangiroa,
And it's a bit,
bei einer Samoanerin,
watch now, eyebrows. Very delicate sign.
bei einem Mann von Moorea,
Morea is in a normal projection.
einer Zpoli
you
von
see
den
better.
Philippinen und einem Akta-Mann, ebenfalls von den Philippinen. Ein Mann
That's
von den
nice.
Trobriandinseln bei Neuguinea begrüßt so mit wiederholtem Brauenheben einen Säugling.
Greeting a baby like this with
Und
eyebrows.
auch die kleinen
and
Kinder
does
der
it. And
Trobriander
now we have a baby.
beherrschen dieses freundliche Zeichen.
Eyebrow flashing. And I think that's the time when we can end. We have got a
Im
very
Hochland
nice
von
greeting.
Westneuguinea
Those they
galt der
are also.
Augengruß von
But,
jungen EPO-Frauen den europäischen
You
Besuchern.
decide when we stop.
Danach waren
Ja,
sie verlegen.
Good. Okay.
Prägnante Elemente,
No, go on.
Lächeln,
Okay.
Augengruß,
These were
Kopfwegdrehen,
the
Verlegenheitsgesten.
April. And now she's giving to this baby here an eyebrow greeting.
Das
She's
schnelle Brauenheben zeigten sie auch gegenüber Kindern. Augengruß bei zwei Männern der
that's in
Voitakten.
slow motion.
Ein Bewohner Neuguineas ist auch
That's
dieser
the,
Ulimann.
this is all New Guinea, different tribes.
Die Himba im Südwesten
Now
Afrikas kennen
Himba.
den Augengruß. Eine junge Frau in zärtlicher Interaktion mit einem Jungen.
Kissing and eyebrow flash.
Derselbe
Also the
Säugling
males
ist
do
von
it,
seinem
but I
Vater
think we
mit
can stop
Augengruß
now,
bedacht.
since otherwise it's too long. Yes, I want to finish with this eyebrow flash. I may add that these films are also documents of people that are destroyed by the process of acculturation, since these are people which count only 10,000 or 20,000 heads. They occupy large areas which are of interest to the technical civilized world, and they have, to start with, not the habit of division of labor. There are no carpenters or glassmakers or smiths, etc. there, and therefore they have no skills which they could apply and no market to adapt to. And that's the real tragedy of these people. And I'm not only interested in animal behavior and nature conservation on the Galapagos, but of course also in the fate of these people, since if you, in a longitudinal study, I went to the same people again and again and the same village, then you get an attachment. Thank you very much.
Professor Eibl-Eibesfeldt, io non so se lei potrà includere nella lista delle sue espressioni anche quella da conferenza di grande successo, insomma. Il nostro sorriso, lei lo può includere, è una tipologia nuova di sorriso che lei può includere. I translate you. You understood? You understood? Ok. Grazie per questa cosa stupenda che ci ha donato.
La cerimonia si avvia a conclusione. Preghiamo il gentile pubblico intervenuto di rimanere al proprio posto per permettere l'uscita dei cortei. Per primo esce il corteo rettorale e preceduto dal magnifico rettore professor Pierugo Calzolari. Lo seguono il preside della facoltà di Psicologia, professoressa Bruna Zani, il proponente la laurea professor Noam Chomsky, professoressa Silvana Contento, il proponente la laurea al professor Irenäus Eibl-Eibesfeldt, dottor Marco Costa. Chiudono il corteo i laureati Noam Chomsky e Irenäus Eibl-Eibesfeldt.